An American war machine given a second life.
Landing people on the moon was an epic-defining moment, but it wasn't the end of the mission.
An eerie shrine in Bulgaria that offered the promise of immortality.
Children would burst into tears at the sight of the departed father of their country.
An attack on a British city designed to grind its people into submission.
As much as 95% of its buildings were damaged or destroyed.
And an Italian labor of love, born from the ashes of trauma.
This was architecture intended to look forward to a new kind of future.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, sites haunted by the past, their secrets waiting to be revealed. In California, USA, lies a behemoth with a story that is out of this world.
Obviously, we're in San Francisco Bay. This is a bustling bay with lots of industry, lots of naval facilities.
And then you come up and you see this huge vision before you. And there's no mystery what this is. It's an aircraft carrier.
It's imposing, it's sleek, it's deadly.
Inside, the vessel has everything you'd expect to see on board a US Navy ship.
Everywhere you turn, there are more dials, more instruments, more screens.
And then there are rows and rows of beds for the crew. There's a kitchen. There's just everything that you need to survive and function. It's essentially a floating city.
This ship served a vital role in the 20th century's greatest conflict. But there are features that reveal it also had another mission.
And that's this Airstream trailer parked conspicuously with a presidential seal on it. And that suggests that this aircraft carrier had a very specific purpose in addition to its wartime roles.
Right now we're in what's called primary flight, and it's basically the same thing as air traffic controller at a civilian airport. The air boss would be running the show up here, directing flight operations down on the flight deck.
Retired US naval officer Ron Capper has inspected numerous aircraft carriers over his military career. This one, the USS Hornet, is a true legend.
The Hornet was part of a carrier task group that was responsible for launching many strikes. The carrier could launch planes about every 30 seconds. They were the most modern and the biggest of the time.
Construction begins in August of 1942, and it's finished in August of 1943. It took just 1 year to build this massive aircraft carrier.
When launched into action against the Axis powers in World War II, she was a fearsome beast.
The ship was stocked with some serious air power, including air groups of fighter, bomber, and torpedo squadrons.
If you look at the USS Hornet, the history of this ship, it is intertwined with the history of the American War in the Pacific in World War II.
The ship fought in multiple campaigns in New Guinea, in the Philippines, in Iwo Jima, Saipan. It had like 7 battle stars.
The Hornet's most famous engagement was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea was quite historic. The Japanese were looking for the Americans, and they were in the Philippine Sea around the Mariana Islands. And the Japanese actually spotted the fleet before the Americans had, discovered the Japanese.
The Japanese launched everything they had from their own carriers to try to wipe out the American carrier fleet. The Hornet was among the ones sent by American admirals in the Pacific to intercept. And they had this phenomenal shoot-down ratio. Over 500 Japanese aircraft shot down with a loss of something like 30 American planes.
The Japanese fight and fight, but they get crushed and are never able to significantly strike with their carriers again.
As the battle in the Pacific Theater raged on, the Hornet's crew worked tirelessly to press home their advantage.
Life for the crew during World War II was very hectic, very hot, and very busy. There was something going on all the time, especially when you were in battle conditions. You were either preparing for battle, you were fueling up, ready to go into another battle, you were arming up, you were taking on stores. There was something going on 24/7 every day.
And they continued to deliver knockout blows.
In just 18 months of combat operations, the crew of the USS Hornet shot down 668 Japanese planes and sank over 1 million tons of Japanese ships.
At the war's end, the ship was modernized and sent back out to sea to support the fight against Vietnamese communists. But soon, it would be called to take part in its greatest operation yet.
On July 12, 1969, the Hornet slipped her moors at Pearl Harbor and embarked on a new mission in the Pacific.
Built for battle, the ship was pressed into the service of science.
1 week later, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful.
The Apollo 11 mission was so important and so symbolic. The idea of landing a man on the moon was something that people have dreamed of for centuries.
For those of us old enough to remember watching this, it's hard enough getting these guys into space, and then somebody had to pick them up, and that was the job of the USS Hornet. The Hornet's basically an airport at sea, and it's the perfect base of operations to recover this capsule, which is going to come hurtling out of space and land in the ocean.
The 23rd of July, early afternoon. The Hornet waited in the pre-designated splashdown zone, while the Apollo 11 astronauts made their final checks.
In June of '69, Captain Cyberlick was in command. They did like 15 or 16 simulated retrievals, to make sure that everything was prepared and the crew was prepared.
Weeks of planning were about to be put to the test as the eyes of the world watched on. But there was a problem.
Top secret reconnaissance satellite recon information held that a storm was threatening the original splashdown zone, but they couldn't really tell the guys at NASA how they knew this, so it was all very cloak and dagger.
To come down in the middle of a storm like this could have torn the parachutes that were bringing the capsule in to shreds, which meant that they would have hit the water at much too high of speed and very likely killed the astronauts on impact.
Fearing catastrophe, the operative that spotted the danger circumvented protocol to alert a chief naval officer to the peril that lay in wait.
And little known fact, the splashdown zone was actually moved 250 miles at the last minute.
On the 24th of July, in the final hours before splashdown, the Hornet raced to take up its new position. The crew was on high alert. Returning astronauts were not the only visitors they were expecting.
Early in the morning, President Nixon arrived aboard Marine One. My past history in the Navy, when we had dignitaries aboard, it was all spick and span. You don't want anything to go wrong, so I'm sure, tensions were high.
It must have been hell for the skipper having the President of the United States, his commander-in-chief, on board looking over his shoulder.
Meanwhile, the Columbia capsule hurtled back to Earth.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
Around 6 a.m., they see Columbia come through the atmosphere and land in the water.
So the Navy rescue team came up to the capsule on boats, began the process of stabilizing it and getting the crew out, but not before they handed them hazmat suits.
Something that most people don't remember about these lunar missions is that we had no idea what bacteria, what pathogens existed on the moon. So when these guys came back, they had to be very strictly quarantined in case they were carrying some superbug that had never been seen on Earth before.
Once the astronauts arrived on the Hornet, they were placed into what would be their home for the next 4 days.
This is where the astronauts were put inside to where they could get cleaned up and get rid of their contamination suits. As we enter the trailer, off to my right, we have their sitting, eating area right in here. Back in here is their little kitchenette, and actually one of the first microwaves ever produced. So after the astronauts were placed inside the quarantine facility, President Nixon came up and was talking to them through this window right here.
He waves to them and, sort of pantomime shaking their hand and has this little chat through the glass with them.
The Hornet, with its cargo of returning heroes safely on board, then set off for its final destination of Hawaii.
So the astronauts actually stayed in this trailer for the whole journey. Then they were loaded onto a plane, still in the trailer, flown to Houston, where they rode out the rest of their quarantine in a larger facility.
And just a year after participating in this recovery of the astronauts from Apollo 11, the USS Hornet is mothballed and basically put on the shelf. It's ended its useful life, no longer valuable as a naval asset.
In 1998, the ship was donated to the aircraft carrier Hornet Foundation. Its service to America immortalized.
The USS Hornet was turned into a museum so that people could come and learn the story of not only World War II and those post-war years, but also this special story of NASA's Apollo 11 mission.
As you're moving about the ship, you're seeing what the sailors of that period of time, my period of time to be exact, were actually dealing with, what we lived through, what the spaces looked like, how small the passageways were. The USS Hornet to me means a lot, and to be a part of it right now is like going back, being a kid again. And I get to talk to people about the things that the ship did. I can't express how much I like to do that and how much I feel a part of the ship.
The story tells us that carriers are basically a way to achieve a sovereign piece of American real estate in the middle of the ocean, wherever you need it. You can have a capacity to pull a space capsule on board or recover the crew, and you can also launch airstrikes from this thing anywhere, anytime. As the Navy always says, don't piss us off, we can be there in 24 hours or less.
In the Bulgarian capital, where few residents have ventured, is a reminder of a power that once consumed Eastern Europe.
Sofia is a beautiful city. It has got activity, it's got nightlife.
There are no obvious abandoned buildings here. Everything looks very well maintained and even pristine.
Yet, in the center of this immaculate town, hidden from view, is the entranceway to another world.
Here we've got narrow tunnels which are branching off into the darkness.
At the heart of the labyrinthine network lies a Spartan room.
It's almost like an old hospital or maybe an asylum. You have these tiled walls and these thick doors.
There's these old refrigerators with big power supplies, a big metal table. It's just kind of creepy and strange.
When I look at this table, all I can think is this is a mortuary slab.
The reality is that these tunnels were used for a kind of dark propaganda to convince the people to follow a certain way of life.
Behind me, there is a building of National Bank, and in front of me, there is a National Theater building, also the building of Ministry of Defense. But the real story, the hidden story, is underground.
Ivo Mayev is a journalist who has spent many years exploring the city's secret tunnels. The inconspicuous gateway to Sofia's netherworld is located near a busy marketplace.
It's Christmas mood here, but it's quite different downstairs. Very few people know about this place here. Here is the past of Bulgaria.
Most of the tunnels date back to the Cold War, when Bulgaria was a communist country. This government ruled over its people with an iron fist.
Georgy Dimitrov was the leader of Bulgaria. He was put into place by the Soviets in 1946, and he was fine with that. He wanted to be a communist leader. He had no problem following the directives of the Soviets.
Bulgarians readily accepted Dimitrov's dictatorial control, for they were a population in dire need of hope.
Bulgaria was a desperately poor country at the time, and the people saw communism as a way out of this grinding poverty after years of bloodshed and violence.
The Soviets help Bulgaria to very rapidly industrialize. So ordinary Bulgarians are suddenly experiencing a very different standard of living from what went before.
As the country slowly clambered out of destitution, it soon faced a new threat, one that demanded the tunnel's construction.
Official propaganda says that the nuclear war between East and West will happen one day. And that's why officially the government promoted tunnels and shelters as places for security, safety zone for people.
The reality of who the tunnels were actually built for was radically different.
It's believed that this labyrinth encompasses nearly 150 miles of tunnels built as escape routes so that important Communist Party officials could get away in case of a nuclear attack.
So all these tunnels went across the city and went up into all the different important buildings, the bank, different communist leaders' places. It was just a really elaborate way for them to get around with nobody seeing them.
Yet the tunnels weren't just escape routes and passageways for communist dignitaries. They would go on to serve a far more macabre purpose.
So Dimitrov had been in power about 3 years and went on a trip to the Soviet Union and died there. It's unclear what happened. Nobody quite knows what became of him, but we know that he died. And this was a huge blow to the Bulgarian communists.
The solution of the ruling party was to transform their deceased leader into a deity.
Dimitrov is going to be refrigerated, embalmed, plasticized, moisturized, and kept going as long as Bulgaria remains communist.
It was really important to keep the name and the image of Dimitrov alive. He had become central to this idea of what communism was.
To house his body, the government built an extravagant mausoleum.
Just as the pyramids housed the pharaohs, this was to be the eternal home of Dimitrov and the center of political beliefs in Bulgaria.
They put inside a big and very expensive Soviet equipment for freezing, air conditioning, keeping fresh air, and all other functions to be not only a shelter in case of nuclear war, but also to keep at least one mummy of the communist god alive.
Located directly below his shrine was a secret room that connected to the vast tunnel system.
And this is the most interesting place. Here we can see a big hydraulic platform, which is fixed just under the center of mausoleum. So the body of Georgy Dimitrov was here and was pushed up for the visitors in a special glass box.
You had a 7-man team of doctors that did daily inspections of Dimitrov's body. They even took care of his clothes. They had a new suit made for him regularly by his own personal tailor.
Everybody in the whole country is expected to make a pilgrimage to this communist, godless mausoleum as though they were making a pilgrimage to an ancient Christian saint's grave.
I visited at least 3 times when I was in school. What I remember, the cold temperature inside, the smell of something like a hospital, and see a body of a person who I saw only in the books, inside a glass box.
For the next 40 years, Dimitrov's preserved corpse remained an ever-present attraction. But in 1990, his body would be removed and a scandal uncovered.
It is not unreasonable to ask the question, did Dimitrov fall or was he pushed?
Fall of communism officially was in November 1989. 1 year later, the first post-communist government decided to have official funeral of Georgy Dimitrov. Secretly, during the night, his body was transported to the central graveyard and was buried there.
However, when laid to rest, his remains were not entirely intact. An embalmer had removed his brain for examination, as they suspected Russian foul play was the real reason for his untimely death.
He had been called to the Soviet Union by Stalin, and it's there that he died.
The test proved that Dimitrov was poisoned by mercury because in his brain and his hair were registered more than 20 times more mercury, comparing to normal dose for any human body.
It's one of those mysteries that we can't prove, but makes some sense.
Whatever the truth, the mausoleum was demolished after Dimitrov's removal and the tunnels abandoned. It's been over 3 decades since communism's dark shadow lifted from over Bulgaria. Ivo still finds that period painful to remember.
There is no option to have any romantic memories from the communist times. This building was controversial enough. A lot of people hate it, and I am among these people. Because really, this place was the heart of communist propaganda. It was very important, the building, to be demolished.
In northeast England, the city of Hull hides an extraordinary ruin in a very ordinary street.
There are houses, grocery stores, bars, and then right in amongst them all, there's something that you definitely don't expect to see.
This building is in really bad shape, so much so that the whole structure is held up by steel girders and scaffolding.
Something much more destructive than just time has reduced this place to near rubble.
On the edge of town is a brutish construction that at first glance appears entirely unrelated.
Surrounded by lush green farmlands is a series of stout concrete structures that seem to serve no agricultural purpose at all.
And what we're looking at here is a relic of the idea that you could send enough airplanes and drop enough bombs to break the will of a people.
These rural ruins and the battered brick shell 6 miles away are relics of a time when Britain was fighting to preserve its very existence.
The creeping horror of the idea of going to sleep in your bed and never waking up drove the people into the countryside.
Well, when I first came in, it was completely overgrown. The trees had taken over really at the back, and it was almost like a secret garden.
Hilary Byers has fought for decades to save this site from being torn down. She works to ensure the tragedy of what happened here is never forgotten.
We're intending to create memorials around the site, so we shall have boards with names on, but we shall also have interpretation explaining to people just what happened here.
In 1914, when this building was originally constructed, it served the local community as a cinema. It was called the National Picture Theatre.
It could seat over 900 people in its stalls and balcony levels, and it had a 24-foot screen that stretched across the far end of the cinema.
Their advertising material said our chairs are as comfortable as father's armchair at home. You know, they were at pains to tell you this was no flea pit, this was the real deal.
Cinemas like this provided entertainment for rich and poor alike.
One of the reasons for the popularity of the cinema is that it was so affordable. Going to see a show cost under 7 cents.
If they were in the cheaper seats, they would come into this foyer, they would go up steps here or over here and into the auditorium through the doors. And then, of course, the floor gradually sloped down towards the screen.
This was a place where people came to enjoy themselves, to meet up with friends and family. But something happened to threaten all that.
On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, marking the start of the most destructive conflict in human history. 1 year later, the people of Britain felt the full force of Hitler's wrath.
The Germans sent wave after wave of bombers to drop an immense amount of ordnance all over cities in Britain.
The Blitz brought the reality of the war from mainland Europe to the very doorstep of the British people.
Hull was no exception, and its citizens were subjected to a brutal and sustained attack.
Hull is a really important English city. It's industrial, it has a port, but also Hull faces Germany across the North Sea. Unlike some industrial places in the United Kingdom, especially England, Hull is easy to bomb because it's easy to get to.
This meant that the city was also the secondary target for many other German bombing raids.
If you're in Hull, the Luftwaffe gets you when they're coming, but they also get you when they're going.
Ordinary citizens resorted to sleeping in the surrounding fields to survive the night, a practice known as trekking.
They got a decent night's sleep somewhere, wherever they could, and came back into the city the next day.
They would rather sleep rough in the country than get bombed to death in the city.
And the city responded by aiming its defenses up towards the sky. Dennis Chapman is a local historian that helped rediscover this site in 2014.
Where we are now is in the middle of one of the 4 gun emplacements. So the gun itself, which was a 3.7-inch gun, was centrally located here.
Known as Station H31, it was part of a web of gun batteries around Hull, designed to fight back against relentless Luftwaffe attacks.
There should be 7 ammunition recesses, so that's where the shells were stored, and the men would then collect the appropriate shell and obviously feed it into the gun to be fired. And then in addition to those recesses, you've got the 2 shelters, which is where the men would have sheltered when they weren't on the gun. On a busy night, it would be hectic because they'd all be working at once. There'd be information going out to the guns, would be changing all the time as the position of the aircraft would be changing.
But try as they might, Hull's valiant defenders could not stop the bombs from falling.
As much as 95% of its buildings were damaged or destroyed.
All of Europe suffered in the Second World War, but the Home Secretary at the time said it, no place in Britain suffered worse than Hull.
The National Picture Theatre would not escape the carnage. But it wasn't Hitler who had the last laugh.
The circumstances around this building's destruction are truly bizarre. You couldn't write it.
On the 18th of March, 1941, a full house had assembled to watch one of wartime Britain's most popular films.
You've got a movie theater filled with moviegoers watching The Great Dictator. They're watching Charlie Chaplin, a working-class English guy who is mocking Hitler.
As you can imagine, Hitler and his buddies weren't amused at all, but the film was hugely popular with audiences in the US, the UK, and other allied countries. They couldn't get enough of it.
And suddenly the film stops. The projectionist puts a gel on which says that there's an air raid.
For almost 7 hours, Hitler's fury rained down on Hull.
With the air raid siren screaming outside, the people inside must have been terrified. And then the bomb hit.
It sent bricks and debris flying back through the building towards the occupants, taking shelter in the foyer. The smoke and screaming that surrounded them must have been all-consuming.
So it's quite ironic that that was the film that was showing the night that the cinema was bombed.
A room full of English people watching Charlie Chaplin playing the character that is clearly based on Hitler. And then Hitler takes a swat at them. He wanted to punish the British for laughing at him.
In total, 91 people lost their lives that night, including 9 on the road opposite the cinema. But by some miracle, nobody in the cinema died.
The National Picture Theatre was destroyed beyond repair that fateful night. Yet no amount of bombs could break the people's will or stop them laughing at Hitler's expense.
Some British people even look back at this time with a weird sense of nostalgia.
In England, it's called Blitz Spirit.
The sentiment being that if we could survive the Blitz, we can survive anything.
At the conflict's end, most of Britain's destroyed buildings were slowly torn down and replaced with modern structures. That any of this cinema still stands is tribute to the work of people like Hilary.
It's a memorial to everybody, all the civilians who died during World War II, and to the experience of civilians, those who survived as well.
On the outskirts of the Italian capital, nestled in a wooded glade, is a structure built in the name of defiance.
We're in the town of Frejane, a seaside community only about 20 miles outside of Rome.
In the middle of a pine forest lies one of the oddest structures you'll ever see. It's a feast of geometrical shapes hidden amongst the trees.
They're bundled together in a really chaotic way, like a giant game of Tetris.
It seems clear whoever built this place had a disregard for the conventional.
The main building is kind of a study in contradictions. Clearly, they're meant to make some kind of architectural statement, so it's not obvious whether it's a house or a small school or a substation for a power company. It could be almost anything.
Often, structures are a product of their time. This one was a reaction.
This building cannot just be a house. It has to serve some kind of function.
This crazy design is somehow also the proclamation of an ideology.
Io sono figlio unico di 2 architetti e poi sono diventato architetto pure io perché non ho mai pensato che si potesse fare altro.
Reynaldo Perugini grew up in the bizarre structure. This was a home in which the normal rules didn't apply.
Casa è uno spazio aperto, dove non c'è una destinazione ben precisa. Non c'è la sala da pranzo, non c'è la stanza da letto. In particolare, io occupavo questo spazio. Qui c'era il mio letto. Ricordiamoci che questa casa ha più di 50 anni. Immaginatevi quanto era avveniristica per l'epoca.
The project was started by 2 architecture professors from Rome, Giuseppe Perugini and his wife Ugo de Plaisant. They wanted to build a kind of a homestead that would reflect the trends that were moving through architecture at the time.
Italy in the 1950s was changing. Everything from music to cinema and design was taking on a new lease of life. The inspiration was earlier conflict.
Italy's fascist government collapsed at the end of World War II. And in the period that followed, there was a kind of a counter movement that wanted to reject fascism and the kind of monolithic style that we associate with fascist architecture.
And there was no better location for the 2 architects to realize their dream than the glamorous seaside town of Frejane.
Frejane is a popular coastal town that came to prominence in the 1960s and 70s when it was the center of the fashion and cinema worlds.
During this period, it was a place where Italian intellectuals and bohemians would often gather The filmmaker Fellini had a house there and actually shot some scenes in several of his movies, including the film La Dolce Vita.
Over a period of 7 years, architect Giuseppe Perugini, his wife, and later their son, built this place as their eccentric holiday home.
This is Casa Albero, which translates simply as treehouse.
La casa albero si chiama albero perché è sollevata da terra e poi perché è concepita con un sistema modulare di travi, pilastri e piastre che praticamente può essere ripetuto all'infinito.
And in the mind of Perugini, this was supposed to be a never-ending house whose life and energy could go on forever.
This main building was only one aspect of the crazy concept.
Se la casa albero è una casa illimitata, che può crescere indefinitamente nel tempo, accanto, quasi a dialogare, abbiamo pensato di costruire quest'altro esperimento, che è quello della palla. Una parte era il letto, una parte un cucinino e una parte un piccolo bagnetto. E io l'ho adoperata per suonare, data la particolare acustica. Se io batto le mani si sente questo rimbombo che io poi ho anche utilizzato suonandoci il sitar.
Innovation, experimentation, boldness, these are the kind of things that always get people excited. So this house became the venue for some of the craziest parties amongst the rich Italian bourgeoisie.
But Casa Albero's days were sadly numbered. By the mid-1970s, the family used the building less and less. Then, in 1995, Giuseppe Perugini died, followed by his wife 9 years later.
After the architect's death, the house fell into disrepair. It's been vandalized with graffiti, it became a squat and the venue for illegal parties.
That captured the attention of the media, who then branded the structure as abandoned.
Today, this building is a shell of what it once was. Ronaldo, though, has big plans to change all that.
He's tirelessly trying to preserve his family's vision and turn it into a cultural hub once again. And Ronaldo is adamant his father's dream should and will live on.